When you go back to the 93 floods and Chesterfield Valley flooded, sorry for Andy Guns, but there was nothing else there besides a bunch of farmland. Now, it's the world's largest outdoor mall. They built that levee. Now it doesn't flood anymore, but the water still has to go somewhere the next time it rains.
It does, and it's going to go somewhere. And one of the smartest public officials we have in this region on a variety of issues, but very much on this issue, is Steve Ellman, the county executive from St. Charles. And he's been one of the loudest voices opposing massive development in the Maryland Heights area protected by the Howard's Bend levee, because he knows that when the next big flood happens in that area, the water gets pushed to St. Charles. And the flooding in his county, which St. Charles has to deal with flooding regularly because of where it is near the confluence of the country's two great rivers, it's going to get worse and worse. The more levees we build in St. Louis County to try to develop cheap, floodplain land on tax incentives, the more damage we cause in St. Charles County and other places too. So everything is connected, and that's where we as a region, being so divided by municipality and all of that, where we just don't work together on these issues, we have to do a better job of realizing that everything we do related to flood policy affects somebody else upstream and downstream. And I think our awareness is raising somewhat. But the reality of dealing with this is it costs money to do it right. It's the reality of all public policy. At some point, somebody has to pay for good flood development policy, and so far St. Louis has not been willing to pay the price, other than every time we get flooded, we go to the federal government and ask for money to get bailed out.
Tony Messenger with us from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. In this column you write, you spoke to and quoted and brought up this professor from WashU, this Bob Criss, who was on the show, who sort of alerted people to the fact that the Valley Park levee was built higher than it was supposed to be. He made the point on this show a couple weeks ago that, and he's a geologist and a river expert and all this, and he says that Missouri and the region has sort of turned its back on the rivers, and that if we should really be embracing it and using that as an economic engine, that we just have turned our back to.
I spent yesterday morning out in Marthasville in Warren County talking to Connie and Dan Burkhart, who have written a book on this very issue and are working on that issue. I'm going to be writing a column about it this weekend or next week. Their goal is to get the St. Louis region to look to the Missouri River as a greater asset for tourism when you talk about as it winds its way through wine country and the beauty that exists out there. But the problem is, until we develop better policy to make sure that the Missouri River floods aren't worse because we still try to treat it as a navigable river, then those areas are always in more danger of flooding and harder to deal with in terms of tourism. But it is just a beautiful, gorgeous, wonderful rural landscape along the Missouri River and the Katy Trail that has such tourism potential if we adopt better conservation policies to preserve it for the next generation.
Tony Messenger, never boring when you're on the show. Thanks for checking in Tuesdays and Thursdays here and always online at stltoday.com. Tony, have a good weekend.
Good to talk to you. Have a great day.
824, Big 550.